This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 245 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We're always trying to get new information and find edges in fantasy football. Data gets better every year, the analysis gets better every year, and analysts are coming up with new and innovative ways to get better at evaluating this game about a game that we all love playing. One of those analysts is Graham Barfield of NFL.com. Graham and I go way back. He actually wrote for NumberFire years ago, but I haven't gotten him on the podcast yet to talk about his biggest project, which is yards created. So on today's episode, you're going to learn what yards created is all about, and you'll get a better idea as to which rookie running backs this year are worth targeting and worth avoiding. Before getting to Graham's interview, though, I wanted to send another reminder about FanDuel's Home Run Challenge. Each night through May 30th, you can pick 3 players who you think will hit home runs. Winners each night will split a daily $1,000 prize pool, and then if you win any night, you'll get an entry into the $20,000 Home Run Championship on May 31st. It's free to play, so you should do that over on FanDuel.com. All right, Graham, so let's just kick things off with the obvious question of what exactly is yards created? Why did you create it? And what sort of utility does it provide fantasy football managers and football fans in general?
Yards created is a metric that I started 4 years ago now. Basically, I just go in and will chart like the top 10, 8 to 10 incoming rookie running backs coming into the class. And essentially all yards created captures is the yards the offensive line blocks for on a given play and the yards the running back is credited after the offensive line has or has not done its job. And yards created has kind of evolved over the last couple of years. I've added some new things to it. Like I've always charted missed tackles and snaps in the passing game, but I've added personnel packages, stack box, different fronts, and have kind of added to it over the last couple of years, and it's morphed into this kind of all-encompassing thing. It's definitely not a perfect process. As you know, offensive line play and running back play will never be fully divorced. It's just impossible. And we as an analytics community, and you and I definitely know this very well in the NFL, running doesn't really win games. So I always kind of have to preface it with like no running back model is ever going to be perfect. But I do think it's kind of for me at least, I think it's advanced the conversation and understanding where these running backs win coming out of college.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, clearly, given what you just told us about what yards created is and what it encompasses, you're not just looking at counting stats or you're not looking at market share statistics or numbers. But are you doing that when you're looking at these running back prospects? Are you looking at other data to sort of help you capture your opinion on what these running backs are all about?
Of course. I mean, we should never ignore good data, good information that we know is predictive. We know college production, especially amongst receivers, is very predictive. Running backs are a little bit different in the sense that I think people still aren't entirely convinced that bulk production for running backs will perfectly correlate with NFL production. It doesn't always happen. There's obviously give and take with each prospect, but yeah, I mean, context matters, man. Like you should never ignore good data just to ignore it. But yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So you mentioned that you've been doing this for about 4 years now. It was created in 2016. Can you give listeners maybe just like a snapshot of some of the top 5 backs, maybe the bottom 5 backs as well that you've charted through yards created?
Sure, man. The top of the list pretty much started in 2016 with Zeke. Zeke is, I still think, 3rd or 4th in yards created per attempt over the last 4 years. But Joe Mixon smashed yards created. Saquon Barkley literally broke yards created last year. It was pretty phenomenal. Darrell Henderson, who we'll get to here in a minute, and I can't wait to talk about him with you.
Yeah.
He's actually 2nd in yards created per attempt over the last in that span over the last 4 years. But there's some reasons for that. But the bottom 5 are kind of not necessarily like guys you would necessarily expect, but some pretty surprising names. Maybe Ronald Jones is 3rd from last in yards created per attempt among all of the running backs for the last 4 years. Damian Harris is 2nd from last. Mark Walton was dead last. Derrick Henry also 4th from last. Yeah, Derrick Henry's also a little bit of a uh, he also needs a little bit of context just because they slammed him up the middle so
Yeah,
much
that's true. That's
at
true.
Alabama. But yeah, it's definitely like the top five guys mix in Henderson, Barkley, Zeke, Fournette, Kamara, Hunt, McCaffrey. Like those are the top 6, 7 guys. Deontay Foreman too. Those are the top performers, and it's kind of who you would expect.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I liked hearing Ronald Jones's name there too, because that really aligned with some of the data stuff that I was looking at with Ronald Jones, especially his pass catching. That's always something that I like to look at, just because it shows you that teams are utilizing these players in more than one way, and that was just not there in college. And I think people just sort of made excuses for it. So interesting that Ronald Jones is on that list. But with this class, you already mentioned Darrell Henderson. We'll get to him in a second. It wasn't exactly a strong class, but we did still have some good prospects that came from the class. One of those guys, Josh Jacobs, was a first-round pick, obviously. According to yards created, is he truly the best back in this class? And then you already sort of answered this question. He was apparently significantly better than his teammate Damian Harris.
Yeah. I wrote in my yards created breakdown in April, which you can find on yardscreated.com, that Jacobs was by far the RB1 in this class. And I maintain that. I think that if Jacobs isn't your RB1, you're either overthinking it or trying too hard to be contrarian.
Yeah.
He just wins in all 3 phases of the game. He won as a runner, he won as a receiver, and he was a fantastic pass protector in my metrics. Josh Jacobs actually tied Saquon Barkley for the 3rd highest percentage of carries to create 5 or more yards over the last 4 years. Only Joe Mixon and Sony Michel have been better. Jacobs was also second behind only Darrell Henderson in yards gained per route run in this class, and he led the class in pass protection execution rate. I think, man, I don't know about you, but I'm immediately drafting Jacobs in like the 4th and 5th round in my best ball teams where I can get him. And I think he's pretty easily the 101 or 102 in rookie dynasty drafts.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you if you had him then locked in as the 101. To me, it just, if your dynasty team needs a wide receiver, you can feel free to go with N'Keal Harry. If your team needs a running back, then you can go with Josh Jacobs. I have no problem either way with the 101 spot. And then to your point, I mean, I was building on my projections, and Josh Jacobs is a pretty firm RB2 right now. I mean, he's just he's there. So if you can get him in the 4th or the 5th round, I totally agree. I think that's where he should be going. And I think that there's obviously some ambiguity and a ceiling there as well. I think the biggest fear for me is just that he hasn't carried that massive workload, or we haven't seen that just given his role in college. But, if you see that being not that big of a hurdle, I don't think it's necessarily that big of a hurdle. I see it more as this is what his ceiling could be. That's what makes me excited about Josh Jacobs and his landing spot, to be honest.
Yeah, the landing spot's fantastic in terms of opportunity. Also, I mean, just as a receiver, we don't necessarily have, like I said, we don't have the bulk stats with Jacobs, but like we saw the small sample production as a receiver, and that's what gives me, I think, maybe the most, what gets me most excited is for him as a receiver.
Yeah, absolutely. So Devin Singletary is a running back that I didn't like at all entering the draft. But now we know that he did find a decent landing spot, and he had pretty good draft capital associated with him. But with Singletary, I sort of have 2 questions. So first, did yards created like him? But second, are you able to do any adjusting for players who played for smaller programs like Devin Singletary, or have you found that just doesn't really matter?
I think adjusting for offensive line play and for competition definitely matters a little bit. Again, it's just one of those context things that you just have to boil it down to the individual player. And for Singletary, FAU's offensive line was horrendous. They're actually last in the class in yards blocked per attempt. With that being said, though, Devin Singletary was he just kind of reminded me a little bit of a type of player who does everything decently well, but doesn't have one calling card.
Yeah.
He's undersized, like 5'7", 200 pounds, and the majority of his missed tackles came through power. He's not a quick, elusive guy, and it was also compounded and shown at the combine. He had a 15th percentile weight-adjusted 40 time. The landing spot, though, is what keeps the light on for me, though. Just think about it. I mean, LaShawn McCoy and Frank Gore are not going to be on the roster in 2020. TJ Yeldon is essentially on a 1-year deal. Singletary right now is the only back on their depth chart that they've actually seriously invested in. So that's what kind of keeps the light on for me for redraft and for dynasty purposes. But I'm kind of with you that I think he hammered non-Power 5 competition and just is a basically borderline NFL athlete. There's quite a few red flags for Singletary to overcome, including his yards created metrics too.
Yeah, totally agree. And again, the landing spot isn't bad at all for the reasons that you noted. I mean, he's playing behind some grandpas there in Buffalo. But at the same time, it's just scary that he is so undersized, and you have your on the field concerns as well. But let's get to Darrell Henderson now. We already talked about him a little bit. He had one of the more interesting production profiles in this class, I would say, because he didn't necessarily see a ton of volume, but box score wise, it's really hard to find a more efficient running back than Darrell Henderson. But what I've found is that efficiency doesn't necessarily translate as seamlessly or as well as just like guys who are getting a ton of volume on the ground and through the air. But then again, we haven't seen a running back with this type of efficiency arguably ever. So I'm curious, what did yards created say about Darrell Henderson? You said that he was a top 5 running back, or at least close to that, within the metrics so far. And do you think that this landing spot on the Rams, aside from all the Todd Gurley stuff, do you think that it is sort of an interesting one given his skill set?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. This,
Nice.
When he was first drafted, like I didn't know how to process it, especially since the fact the Rams traded up, albeit it wasn't a huge trade up, but I mean, they did trade up to get him. The more I've kind of processed it and the more I've thought about it, I think the Rams are more than concerned about Gurley's left knee.
Yeah.
Obviously, he may have arthritis in it, and he couldn't get on the field ahead of C.J. Anderson in the postseason. And the Rams just matched the Lions offer sheet for Malcolm Brown. That being said, yeah, Henderson blew up yards created. He posted the second best score in yards created per attempt over the last 4 years, behind only Joe Mixon. Obviously led the class in yards created per attempt. But that's a little there's definitely some context that needs to be shown there. Like Memphis offensive line and their scheme as a whole was one of the best I've ever charted over the last 4 years. In fact, their offensive line opened up the most yards blocked per attempt I've ever charted over the last 4 years. Henderson definitely had some gaping holes to run through, but he's just so explosive, not only in a straight line, but in terms of his elusiveness too. And I think he kind of fits this mold of this like hybrid type player that I think we'll start seeing NFL teams use more, is like these 8 to 12 carry type running backs that you use in all different ways in the passing game too. He led the class in yards per route run, and was also split out from formation as a receiver a few times. I think Henderson has like league-winning potential if Todd Gurley is in fact not close to 100%. We just won't know that because Sean McVay has repeatedly lied to us about Todd Gurley.
Right.
But yeah, I love Darrell Henderson, and I've been targeting him pretty heavily in my best ball leagues.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question then. With rookie drafts, with Darrell Henderson, are you then locked in as him being a first-round pick?
I don't think pretty much anyone outside of like the top 4 or 5 guys in my mind are Harry, Jacobs, Miles Sanders, David Montgomery, and A.J. Brown. Everyone else after that, I have no problem what order you want to put them in. If you want to put T.J. Hawkinson at 6, where I have him, that's fine. If you want to put Darrell Henderson at 6, there's no problem with that. I just think this year is so wide open.
Yeah.
And so for Dynasty specifically, it's just kind of come down to your team. Like, what do you feel like your team needs? And I think you mentioned it too at the top, is like, if you desperately need a receiver, I'm fine taking the Harry at 1. I'm also fine taking Jacobs at 1.
Yeah, makes sense. You just mentioned 2 of the backs that are probably the 2 outside of Jacobs that are going to get the most redraft hype, and obviously they're in the top half of the first round of rookie drafts, and those are Miles Sanders and David Montgomery. What does yards created say about them?
Yes, well, let's start with Montgomery because I think he's a little bit more interesting in terms of his profile. He actually led the class in missed tackles forced per attempt, but he was best used by far when Iowa State ran him off tackle. Montgomery is not a super bursty or super speedy guy not only in a straight line, but also within like 2 to 3 yards. In terms of yards created per attempt on inside carries, David Montgomery was last in the class, but he actually led the class in yards created per attempt on the carries that are off tackle. And we know the Bears love to use outside zone They averaged over 5.5 yards per carry on carries off tackle last season. I think this is a perfect landing spot. The Bears have now 250 carries from Jordan Howard available, and Tariq Cohen in his career has not shown that he's a particularly good rusher. I'm kind of investing in David Montgomery. I'm dabbling in the 5th or 6th round in redraft, but Miles Sanders, I think, is the more valuable player for redraft this year. I think there's just more value at his ADP. And I think the Eagles, man, like, I don't know about your opinion on this. I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, but I think the Eagles have been wanting to have a workhorse, maybe not a workhorse in the sense of Le'Veon Bell, but a number one back. And I think they finally found it with Miles Sanders.
Yeah, and to that point, I've talked about it before on this pod, actually. Like, I think that the idea that Doug Peterson and his teams have had these committee approaches has to do more with what they've been given than what they want to do. Because if you look at it, the only running backs on the Eagles roster in this Peterson era that have played a full 16 games have been LeGarrette Blount and Wendell Smallwood. Let's not pretend that those are two backs that you really want to feed in your offense in general. So I agree with you. I mean, look at the draft capital. Look at what they have in that backfield. I think Miles Sanders could easily see a lot more volume than people are giving him credit for, just because he landed on the Eagles.
Right, exactly right. And I mean, we know what that offense is capable of when they're 100% clicking. I think Sanders has a huge ceiling, and he kind of flashed in all 3 phases of his game. There's a lot I think he's going to have to clean up in terms of his vision and bouncing runs. I think at times he I won't say he hesitated too much, but it's just like he didn't really trust what his offensive line was doing in front of him at Penn State. But I think that boils down to he just needs more repetition. And for his credit, too, he came in and handled 74% of Penn State's handoffs last year, and he was on the field for 75% of their snaps per Pro Football Focus. So, I mean, he was a workhorse running back for the Nittany Lions last year. I'm very, very excited for Sanders and have really warmed on his landing spot in the last couple of weeks as well.
Nice. Yeah, I'm totally with you with that. All right, before I let you go, Graham, are there any running backs in this year's class who you think could surprise us all and have much better careers than we're currently anticipating?
I really wish I could give one, man, but this is it's just such a weak class. I really want to give like a great sleeper running back, but I don't feel great about anyone.
How do you feel about Justice Hill? Because he's someone that I've been sort of targeting in that second round range of rookie drafts, because the landing spot's interesting. He obviously complements Mark Ingram pretty well, or any bigger bodied back that they would have in that backfield. But that's kind of what this class is, right? You need to find someone who does one thing very well and hope that kind of takes off.
Yeah, Justice Hill is interesting, but again, that Ravens backfield is a little bit murky right now. But
sure,
again, in 2020, it won't be. For dynasty purposes, it will not be.
Right.
Gus Edwards and Ken Dixon are both free agents. Hill is interesting. I did not chart him for yards created. Unfortunately, didn't have time to. But obviously, the 4.3 40, and he was a decent receiver. At least there's a little bit of a sample size to work from with him as a receiver at Oklahoma State.
Yeah, definitely. Graham, really appreciate you hopping on and sharing your insights on yards created. For those of you who aren't following Graham on Twitter, make sure you are. He's at Graham Barfield, and I'm also on there at Late Round QB. And you can find this podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found, so make sure that you subscribe. I won't be getting you a mailbag episode again this week due to travel, but I'll be in your ears early next week with a brand new show. Until then, if you really want to hear my voice, you can check out my Evergreen Episodes playlist on SoundCloud, or just listen to older episodes from this offseason. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you next week.